The Myth of Simple Commodity Production by Christopher J. Arthur. The New Palgrave, a Dictionary of Economics of 1987, represented the distilled wisdom of the economics profession. The article on Karl Marx was written by the leading Marxist theorist of the day, Ernest Mandel. This multi-volume work included enough articles on Marxism to enable a separate volume on it to be extracted and published. The New Palgrave Marxian Economics in 1990, in which Mandel's overview had pride of place. Mandel referred to what Marx calls simple commodity production. In this, quasi-official expression was given to the most enduring myth of Marxology. For Mandel was following a very long tradition. Paul Sweezy, in his much-used classic textbook, The Theory of Capitalist Development, stated, quote, Marx begins by analyzing simple commodity production, end quote. Notice the quotation marks around simple commodity production, but as with Mandel, unsupported by any actual reference. Earlier in the 30s, Oscar Lange, in explaining Marx's theory of value, said Marx starts with such a notion. Marx calls it simple commodity production. A later authority, R.L. Meek, in his 1967 essay on Karl Marx's economic method, alleged Marx had a model he called simple commodity production. But the simple truth is that Marx never called anything simple commodity production. The term cannot be found in his writings. Who then introduced the term simple commodity production? The term occurs in Engels' preface and supplement to his edition of Capital Volume 3, and it was interpolated by him into the text itself, as keen-eyed readers can deduce from the editorial brackets surrounding the passage containing it. In his preface, Engels claimed that at the beginning of Volume 1 of Capital, Marx, quote, takes simple commodity production as his historical presupposition, only later proceeding on this basis to come on to Capital, end quote. The advantage of this was that he could proceed from, quote, the simple commodity, and not from a conceptually and historically secondary form. The commodity is already modified by capitalism, end quote. This is in fact a misreading. Marx never used the expression simple commodity production in Capital. Likewise, it is certain Marx never referred to the capitalistically produced commodity as a secondary derivative form. Marx certainly does not develop the idea of simple commodity production at the point where it was supposed to be under discussion, namely the first few chapters. Rather, as the first sentence of Volume 1 makes clear, the simple circulation discussed in the first few chapters is that of the capitalist economy. The only occurrence of the term simple commodity production in the whole 3 volumes of Capital occurs in Volume 3, but this is in a passage given to us subsequent to Engels' editorial work, as he himself warns us in a note. It is now possible to check this against the manuscript itself, which has been published in the new Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. It is clear that the entire paragraph was inserted by Engels, as indeed was the one on the next page about Capital's, quote, historical mission. Later in the text, Engels also inserted the phrase, quote, and commodity production in general, end quote. It is not very useful for an editor to impose his own reading on the text. Why, then, did Engels do it? The reason can be established with some precision. However, first let us note that Engels' cast of mind was primarily historical. In his review of Marx's 1859 contribution to the critique of political economy, he put forward what came to be known as the, quote, logical historical method, end quote. Another term Marx never used, by the way. When he responded to the first proofs of Capital, he reacted to the proposal to add a special appendix on the value form by arguing that this take the shape of a proof from history. Marx ignored this advice. However, when Engels came to write prefaces to Capital Volume 1 in 1883, 1886, and 1890, Engels did not suggest that the first part was historical. nor did Engels refer to simple commodity production in his preface to Volume 2. It was only in the 1894 preface to Volume 3 that Engels came up with the idea of simple commodity production in the context of judging what has been called the, quote, prize essay competition, end quote, in which people have been challenged by Engels in his preface to Volume 2 to solve the problem of generating a uniform rate of profit on the basis of the law of value. This gives us the requisite context for understanding Engels' intervention. Engels became involved in the discussion of simple commodity production because it seemed that in the third volume of Capital, Marx abandoned the law of value in favor of another principle of price determination. Of course, in Marx's procedure, values are a stage in the process of generating the Volume 3 prices of production. But if such values are not empirically present, because such values are superseded by these prices of production, are these values not merely fictitious? Engels reacted to this possibility by interpreting the stages of Marx's presentation historically in order to ensure that the values were indeed empirically visible, but of course in the past, before capitalism, quote, modified the relationships involved. Thus, when in response to Capital Volume 3, Conrad Schmidt put forward the thesis that the, quote, value discussed in Volume 1 is a, quote, necessary fiction, Engels wrote to Conrad Schmidt, arguing that the value is real enough for practical purposes at the stage of, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. The day before writing to Schmidt, Engels had written to Werner Sombart in much the same vein, arguing that, quote, value had a direct and real existence at the time when, quote, commodity exchange began, end quote. But, quote, this direct realization of value no longer happens, end quote. For, quote, the value of the capitalist mode of production is so thoroughly hidden, end quote. So strongly did Engels feel about this that he wrote a special paper on the subject, which was placed as a supplement to the second edition of Capital Volume 3. Engels was, in the second edition of Capital Volume 3, the supplement to it, concerned to dispel any doubt that, quote, what is involved is not just a logical process, but a historical process, end quote. After developing the point at length, Engels concluded that, quote, Marx's law of value applies universally as much as any economic laws do apply. For the entire period of simple commodity production, i.e. up to the time at which this undergoes a modification by the onset of the capitalist form of production. It is true that Engels was able to cite a passage from the manuscript of the third volume in which something like the content of the idea of a stage of simple commodity production was mentioned by Marx. Seizing enthusiastically on this, Engels claimed that if Marx, quote, if Marx had been able to go through the third volume again, Marx would undoubtedly have elaborated this passage significantly. However, it is just as possible that Marx would have decided this passage was a false trail and eliminated it. Certainly, odd reference in Capital to pre-capitalist production are not used with any systematic intent. Engels, Sweezy, and Meek all wrongly believe Capital starts with, quote, simple commodity production. However, Engels, Sweezy, and Meek characterize simple commodity production's status. For Sweezy, the virtue of simple commodity production was simple commodities production's theoretical clarity as the starting point for a logical derivation, and not simple commodity production's supposed empirical reality as a part of a, quote, corrected history, as simple commodity production was for Engels. Meek went on an ambiguous middle position. Simple commodity production was not a myth, Meek argued, but methodology. Methodology with myth instead of meth. But the belief Marx began with something like he called simple commodity production is the real myth. Generations of students have been taught Marxist economics on the basis of a distinction between capitalist production and, quote, simple commodity production. Yet this simple commodity production versus capitalist production distinction approach descends from Engels, not Marx. To turn to the present, let us look at the most widely read popularization of Marx's economics, Ben Fein's Marx's Capital. Ben Fein's Marx's Capital has been through 4 editions since 1975 and has been reprinted many times. As late as the 3rd edition of 1989, there still occurs the flat statement, quote, Marx called such a situation simple commodity production, end quote. Only in the 4th edition of 2003 is this modified to often termed simple commodity production, end quote. The most commonly used English edition of Capital today has an introduction by Mandel, which he says that Marx could not start with capitalist production, i.e. generalized commodity production, because capitalist production, i.e. generalized commodity production, springs logically and historically from, quote, simple commodity production, end quote. How did it happen? No one ever actually looked to see if Marx said Part 1 was about simple commodity production. On the face of it, there seems no ready explanation for such an extraordinary failure of scholarship. The explanation is that behind this myth lies another, that Marx and Engels were the same person, the greatest testimony to which is the absurdity of the collected works of 50 volumes devoted to 2 authors who hardly ever published joint works. Meek, in all his work, was absolutely unself-conscious about treating Marx and Engels as one person. Throughout, Meek quoted freely from Engels when purporting to give Marx's views. For example, I still think I was right in laying special emphasis on Marx's, quote, logical historical method, end quote. Indeed, if I think I underestimated to the extent Indeed, if anything, I think I underestimated the extent to which Marx's economic work was guided by the logical historical method. Marx's logical transition in Capital from the commodity relation as such to the, quote, capitalistically modified form of this relation is presented by Marx as the mirror image of a historical transition from simple to capitalist commodity production, end quote. R.L. Meek. The quote by him in this remark is simply false, because all the quoted material in this passage is not from Marx but from Engels. However, if Engels in his preface took it for granted everyone knew Marx started with simple commodity production, this may have been because of Karl Kautsky's little book, Economic Doctrines of Karl Marx. Economic Doctrines of Karl Marx appeared in 1887 and was an immediate success, selling 5,000 copies straight away. In this, quote, simple commodity production is mentioned in the first chapter. There are also references to simple commodity production throughout the last chapter. Undoubtedly, Kautsky's interpretation had a continuing influence, for the book was reissued many times. But it would be hasty to assume that Kautsky invented the term. Engels drew Kautsky's attention to the importance of simple commodity production as early as a letter of June 26, 1884, so priority lies with Engels. It is evidence of the enormous authority of Engels as interpreter of Marx's meaning that the standard text for so long repeats his view of the matter. Now, pity the situation of the, quote, orthodox indexer. Since Engels said so, it must be true that Part 1 of Capital 1 deals with simple commodity production. But there is no mention of it. This did not prevent Donna Torr, for example, indexing no less than 20 pages of Capital Volume 1 under the head Simple Commodity Production. If there are no references, invent fictitious references. This was a 1938 edition of Capital based on a reissue of Engels' edition. Anyone today who attempts to follow up my remarks about simple commodity production themselves will discover a very strange fact. In the Marx-Engels collected works, the 3 volumes of Capital are indexed together at the end of Volume 37. When consulting this index, one finds that there is one reference to simple commodity production directly and another in relation to capitalist production. Both of these are to pages of Volume 1, but nothing of the kind appears there. By contrast, the 3 occurrences of the term in Volume 3 mentioned above are not listed. How can anyone conduct research on this basis? The solution to this mystery is that this index has been compiled simply by zipping together the existing indexes of the separate volumes previously put out by Moscow. A few false entries have been deleted, but no attempt has been made to achieve concordance. The indexes to volumes 2 and 3 were compiled in the 50s for the Foreign Languages Publishing House. The person who compiled this index for volume 3 evidently thought the term simple commodity production not worthy of mention, an interesting fact in itself. Volume 1, published in 1954, did not have a subject index at all, but when the 3 volumes were brought out again by Progress Publishers, Volume 1 was supplied with an index later. This time, the person responsible put in a couple of fictitious entries. It is to be regretted that the indexes of the new mega editions of Volume 1 also make concessions to the myth of simple commodity production. For the first edition, Megalist Warenproduktion einfacher, and gives 3-page references, but on none of these pages does the term simple commodity production appear, and in my opinion nothing corresponding to its meaning appears either. However, when Mega gives the original manuscript of Volume 3, it does not list the terms in its index, does not list the term simple commodity production in its index very rightly. Here I have dealt with a strictly philological issue. Behind that lie interpretive issues and substantive interpretive issues. I believe in both Engels is seriously misguided. It is open to anyone to support Engels' reading in one or both aspects. But in the future I hope such people will not refer to, quote, what Marx called simple commodity production, end quote, but to, quote, what Engels called simple commodity production, end quote. I have argued elsewhere that Engels' reading of Capital is wrong-headed, but if so, how did it happen that the myth went unchallenged? While the authority of Engels was important in this, there must have been a predisposition present in readers of Capital to find the concept of simple commodity production congenial. There are 3 considerations I offer to explain this. A. The first generation of Marxists, such as Engels and Kautsky, who were also enthusiastic about Darwin, believe that Marx made a uniquely powerful contribution to the critique of political economy insofar as he systematically differentiated between modes of production on a historical basis. Capitalism was a historically specific social formation. They confused this genuine insight of Marx's with a methodological imperative to explain things in terms of historical origins and development, albeit suitably dialecticized. What this missed was the possibility that Marx intended a rigorously logical ordering of concepts, employing not a historical dialectic, but a systematic dialectic of the kind found in Hegel's logic, wherewith an abstract beginning is sequentially concretized. B. The following generations of Marxists included those educated in economics departments, who absorbed a different methodology, namely modeling. They naturally found in Capital a number of such models, beginning with simple commodity production. They read the book as a sequence of more and more complex models, approximating more and more to the real object. C. By the time Capital appeared, Hegel was a dead dog to such an extent. C. By the time Capital appeared, Hegel was a, quote, dead dog, to such an extent that nobody was in a position to understand and assess Marx's somewhat nuanced acknowledgement of Hegel's influence. Dialectical thought of the kind found in Capital is no longer familiar even to scholars. Even if Marx had provided more guidance in a suitably didactic methodological introduction, readers would have found it difficult to fathom. Without it, they were lost. The afterword Marx put in the second edition of Volume 1 certainly raises more problems than it solves. This suggests to me that Marx was not himself clear about the issue. The, quote, hiddenness, end quote, of the systematic dialectical method in the argument itself may not merely be in the interest of popularization. To some extent, it must have been hidden from Marx himself. Any attempt to recover it may well require some reconstruction of the argument. But that takes us well beyond the simple point I am making in this article.